The next block of talks that we have are lightning talks. The lightning talks are 10 minutes each, and they don't include Q&A time. But we do have beer and gear just afterwards, as was just mentioned, and you can take your questions to the speakers there. I'm sure they'd be happy to talk to you. Our first lightning talk is from Ronan Mulali from Akamai and preparing for a DOS attack. That goes forward, that goes back. Okay. Just stay above the foot from the microphone.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is a nice talk to follow the one that was just presented before this, because quite a bit of it is relevant to what was just discussed. This is another talk about the cloud. Look how white it is, look how fluffy it is. Isn't it wonderful? Someday the cloud's going to do this to you. And do you have one of these? This talk is effectively a short checklist of things you can do to prepare for the day that the cloud decides to rain on top of you. And it's based on a few years I spent working in Prolexic, which is how I arrived in Akamai. So first thing you need is a plan. You've got to be prepared. You need to know what you can do when that day comes. Find out what your upstreams can do for you, and know how to do it, know where to ask, know how to trigger it. You should consider your AUPs, both yours that you provide to your customers and the ones that you as a customer get from your upstreams, because you may find that when the day comes that you're out of luck. You need to be nimble. You need to be able to move targets and adjust your routing policies. Load DNS TTLs on customers or IPs that attract targets can be useful. If you can put targets on IP space that can be routed independently, it gives you some options in terms of where attack traffic may enter your network. And you need to have the whistles and bells in your routing policies to be able to move stuff around within minutes to make, to move traffic so it doesn't hurt you too much. You've got to be aware of what's going on. If you don't already, you should monitor everything. Bit rates and packet rates on interfaces, net flow, S flow. Exchange points often provide per peer stats to give you some idea of what peer is sending traffic your way. And span ports and taps can give you some information as well. If you don't know what's going on, you're in the dark. If you see a sudden increase in traffic and you can't decide what IP or what range of IPs is attracting that, you don't know who the target is and you don't know how to fix it. It's also worth knowing what's going on downstream. Your customer may have a perfectly good reason for seeing half the NTV traffic in the world, or they might just only want to see port 80 TCP. If that's the case, then you can pretty safely filter everything else. It's important to have a good DNS infrastructure, because if your DNS or your customer's DNS is broken, so are you. Two examples here. The one on the left is a pretty standard zone. It's got 2 authoritative name servers. They may be anycast potentially, but more often than not, they aren't. And it's pretty easy to take down both name servers and knock a particular domain offline. On the right, we have a much longer authoritative list, and all the hosts on that list, as far as I know, are anycast. So there are hundreds, if not thousands, of servers there that can answer DNS queries. It's a very tough target to take down. Don't rely on a firewall. State kills. It only takes a matter of moments to overflow a state table with a spoof DDoS attack. Just so many flows are established in a fraction of a second. If you can have multiple paths into your network, you can spread the pain of the attack. It gives you a broader surface over which to spread the traffic, and allows you to apply different policies and different measures on different paths. If, for example, most of your traffic comes in over peering in a given location, you could potentially apply a much stricter policy to traffic arriving via transit and let peering traffic through more or less unscathed. As Christoph discussed in the last talk, null routing or black holing is an option, but depending on who you are, it can be a good or a bad thing. I'm more or less of the opinion that blanket black hole routing is capitulation rather than mitigation. If you have to resort to it, your customer's, gone, they're down, the attacker is won. When used carefully and when used very tactically, it can be very, very effective. And I've used the black holing function on DKICs in the past on a per pair basis, and it has been very, very effective. So To refer back to the slide about being aware, if you know which peers are sending you traffic, it doesn't really matter if they accept 32s or not. You can send them a 24 just to that peer and make that traffic go away. The rest of the exchange will be oblivious. You can deploy appliances on your network to do mitigation. There are many vendors that offer this service. They'll have a capacity of N gigabits, and some will have the ability to offload some of the burden upstream. They can be useful. They can defer. They can handle a certain number of your attacks depending on how much you apply. But they're expensive, and you still need to have the infrastructure in place to bring the traffic to the hardware in the first place. Not every vector will suit every device. Some are good at some things and not so good at others. And to really make it effective, you need a human element that knows how to operate this device, or to have a range of devices and know how to deploy them for different attacks. And someday you're going to find that you need a bigger boat, because you have N gigs capacity and the M plus 1th gig is a killer. So you can pass that up to somebody else, use somebody else's boat. You'll find that your upstreams will have capabilities they can offer you, possibly as part of your standard service, possibly as an added extra. Or you can use third-party alternatives like CDNs or DDoS protection services. A CDN basically is a user experience or performance play. That can be very good at absorbing DDoS traffic by spreading it over a very wide footprint and basically just ignoring it. But they don't suit all types of legitimate traffic. You have DDoS protection services, which are effectively dedicated capacity sitting there to be used to soak up and scrub DDoS attacks. And they will pass the clean or post-mitigation traffic back to you, typically over rather via a proxy or a tunnel link over the internet, or sometimes a direct connect, depending on the option. So these are generally third-party, over-the-top style solutions. They will be solutions that will be engaged by your customers. So the targets of these attacks, downstream review, potentially this is something that you can direct them towards. So in summary, be prepared, be nimble, be aware, have good DNS. Don't think a firewall will save you. Know how much you can handle, and have some options up your sleeve for stuff that you can't. So there's no questions. If anybody has any questions, by all means, come up outside. I'll be at the session after this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ronan. And James Schaefer, Municipal Utility Marking Codes.
Back and forth. Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for your time. I just want to put out a quick disclaimer before I get started. I'm not an outside physical plant engineer by trade. I'm guessing that most of you also are not of that trade. But if you are, you may find this to be a little bit familiar. If you aren't, though, I'm hoping that you'll find this to be somewhat interesting. And if nothing else, it'll be something that you won't be able to unsee going forward, hopefully. So with that being said, here in Illinois and in Chicago, largely, I think you could make a strong case to have the official state flower replaced with the construction roadside marking cone, given its prevalence in the springtime and how far and wide it reaches. It's hard to go a couple of city blocks in the city here without coming across some of the strange hieroglyphic-looking markings that you might find on the streets and sidewalks here. And these aren't random acts of street art. These are actually utility markings that identify to potential excavators or other concrete cutting or digging utility companies what lies beneath. They can be a couple of different pieces of data, including what the utility is that's buried there, how large it is, what sort of direction it heads, and so on. And the reason why you're encouraged to call your sort of local digger or your dig alert or whatever your municipality is that handles these types of markings 24 to 72 hours ahead of time is because they need some time to do some research and then come on out and mark up the street or the sidewalk or the backyard if they might see flags instead of spray paint to sort of identify what this is. And this obviously helps us from having some unfortunate events occur. So there's sort of a method to these markings. There's some color and some shorthand codes that you'll find with it. But the other thing that sort of is important to keep in mind about these types of markings is that it's not just what they say on the street themselves, it's also what they imply. So for people in our business, this may imply sort of being able to see the future or knowing what's coming. So this is a picture I took right outside one of our facilities on our Loop campus here in Chicago. This is probably about 8 or 9 months ago. And a week later, here we had a construction crew on site that was, in fact, cutting up the street and doing some excavating. And you'll notice our friend and simultaneous nemesis, the backhoe, there in the back left-hand corner there. So the codes themselves, the way that they work is there's a couple of different dimensions to them. One is color. So the markings on the street, the actual color that's used to paint the streets will indicate the type of utility that's below. So for example, if you see red markings, that's typically indicative of electrical buried conduits. If you see blue, it's potable water. Yellow is typically natural gas or some other type of petroleum product. In some cases, steam, if your city has steam tunnels or steam conduits. Green, perhaps appropriately, is sewer, so also something you want to avoid. And the stuff that you'll probably pay most attention to are the orange communication, so buried fiber optics or CATV type stuff, and then white markings which indicate potential routes of cuts or of excavation work that's to be done. And I'll get to why those are also important in just a minute. In addition to the colors, there's also some symbols that you'll see, and I realize now that the font that I used on the symbols themselves was probably way too small to see, so I'll walk you through them real quick. In the upper left-hand corner of the sort of 4 or 5 symbols there, you see a diamond shape, and that's sort of indicative of a single conduit. This is typically centered over where the conduit is buried in the ground, and it runs along the conduit length. Below that is a corridor or sort of maybe a grouping, either a large duct or a grouping of different conduits that are laid next to each other. And again, those sort of outline centered around where the center of those are and outlines the sort of areas where the marker believes that the conduit ends. Next to that is oversized utility, so things like large water mains or sewer pipes. Those will have that sort of sideways H pattern with the line through it. And then above that is a sort of a directional indicator that points to something that may not be right here in the street, but it may be several feet off to the side, and it'll be indicated by the distance to that particular utility, whatever it is. A lot of times you'll see individual conduits that are labeled like the one on the far right, which in this case is an 8-inch low pressure gas marking, and it basically shows you it's a single conduit, heads in a particular direction, and some information about it. And along the left-hand side here, you can see there are some codes, single-letter, multi-letter codes that sort of give some additional hints as to what's in it. So low pressure, high pressure, sometimes it mentions what the conduit's made out of, if it's encased in concrete or if it's plastic or steel. And it's just to give some more information about what's there and how to handle it or how to approach it from the digger's perspective. So here's an example of an actual marking that's right down the street. If you can kind of tell from the handwriting here of the marker, this is an AT&T fiber optic cable. It's noted by the upper right-hand sort of labeling there. It's inside of a microduct or a very, very small duct, and it runs along the path as indicated by the marking. This is actually across a sidewalk. And on the left-hand side is a hand dig notation, sort of indicating that this is probably shallow, very shallow, and otherwise you don't want to be using sort of mechanized tools to get it out of there or to dig around it. So why is this important? Well, for one thing, if nothing else, it's kind of nifty to be able to sort of look at the street and see what's underneath it, like you have X-ray vision or something like that. Like a lot of other things, it seems, in this business, probably 99% of the population have no idea that this stuff is even there or what it's used for or anything like that or whatever, so it's kind of neat to see that. It may help you to also understand sort of what's in your neighborhood around sort of your own facilities that you may have buried in the streets or sidewalk or other places. It also sort of show you what other stuff is around you. So it may be give you some hints as to like what kind of trouble you can expect. If there's a lot of stuff around you, you may have a lot of street work happening. Or it may even show you like sort of what carriers are nearby. So a lot of the major carriers will have stuff in the ground, and you can see this is along their pathway. Of course, the best thing about this is that this is intended to avoid what I refer to as UUBEs, which are unanticipated and unwanted backhoe events, like the ones that you see pictured here below. I don't know if this sent a shudder through anybody in the room. This is a breach that occurred on one of our campuses back in December. It's a fun time of year to have to do some groundwork for sure. And so in conclusion, when you see these markings, sort of be sure that somebody is performing the dark art of conjuring some digging utilities or some digging equipment on a site nearby sometime in the near future. Of course, sort of went through the markings, all have different meanings, and although the standard was sort of proposed by the American Public Works Association, it doesn't necessarily apply to all municipalities. There are some that have some overruling sort of color codes that they use to might indicate Team 1 or Team 2, those types of things. Also, I had a hard time finding information about Canada or Mexico. It seems that Canada doesn't have a specific standard, but my cousin, who's a civil engineer, tells me that they loosely follow a similar code, so he speaks for Canada. Story checks out. Sounds good. So take note of the markings that you may find near any of your facilities or any of your buildings. Number one, of course, this means there's work coming, but you also want to sort of note if your stuff, perhaps more importantly, isn't marked and everything else is, that's something you want to get rectified probably sooner rather than later. And then last, if your contractor who's going to be doing some work for you isn't already, they probably are, but if they aren't already, they're going to want to put white markings on the street where they intend to cut, because that's going to help those utility companies when they come out to mark the streets. It's going to help them to sort of focus on the area to ensure that they're absolutely sure there's nothing underneath there. So that's really it. I think that's my time. No questions, so thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much.